Hey everyone, my name's Josh, and I'm really excited to be doing this podcast with you. I hope that this can be a place where I can discuss what's going on in the world of fandom, from comic book movies to TV shows and different things that are coming out. But this week, and for this first episode, it actually requires a bit of action on your end as well. It's called Reinstate Geoff Johns as the head of DC Films and hold WB executives accountable. The link is in the description, so if you want to sign this petition, go over and do it. I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into why I came to this. And what I want to say is this, I want to say that I'm not looking for anybody to get hurt or for their careers to be put at risk or anything like that. What I'm looking for, though, as a fan of the DC Universe, is for the right people to be held accountable for decisions that made DC films not successful. And so for those of you who don't know, obviously Justice League has not been the box office success that Warner Brothers was looking for. It debuted to $93 million. Now to give you, over a 3-day period. Now to give you a little bit of perspective on why that's not very good, 5 years ago when the Avengers came out, it debuted to over $200 million. So literally over double what Justice League did. And Justice League, I believe, this weekend will, after 3 weeks of release, will finally overshoot what Avengers made in its first 3 days of release. So it's a pretty dire situation for Warner Brothers. They were obviously expecting more than that. I don't know that they were expecting a massive hit. There were indications that the studio were downplaying expectations for the film, because I think they knew that the film had problems, but they certainly weren't expecting a film to struggle to 200 and what looks like it's going to be around $230 million when it's all said and done domestically. So when it's all said and done, Justice League will be the lowest grossing of the 5 films in the DC universe. This week it was announced that there was going to be a shakeup at Warner Brothers. It was announced that John Berg was going to be reassigned to be a producer in Warner Brothers. They claim that he wanted to do that anyway, so it's kind of a natural time for him to do that. They also announced that Geoff Johns will be in an advisory role. Geoff Johns was the co-head of DC Films. Moving forward, the executives of WB would have a more direct role in managing the DC film slate. Now, for those of you who are wondering, that is the worst possible news that could come out of this whole thing. Geoff Johns is the guy that knows these characters inside and out. Geoff understands the core of the characters. Geoff recently relaunched the comics and did a series called DC Rebirth, and it's been massively successful for the publisher. They've caught up to Marvel in a lot of ways. They're still second place, but they're constantly selling better. And the comics, I think overall people would agree that DC Comics right now are far better than Marvel Comics, because the whole goal of the publisher is to get to the core of the character. And when you get to the core of the character is when you have success. And we saw that earlier this year in film as well, with Wonder Woman. The reason why Wonder Woman resonated and why it was so good is because they got to the core of the character. They got to the core that she's a character of hope, she's a character of optimism, she believes in love, she believes in the best in people, and she's a hero, and people resonated with that. And it was super successful as a result. And Geoff Johns was intimately involved with that film. Producer Charles Roven did an interview with Collider where he confirmed that Zack Snyder and Jason Futz came up with a story for it, and Alan Heinberg and Geoff Johns and Patty Jenkins wrote the script. Patty Jenkins and Geoff Johns go uncredited because of union rules, but they developed the script together, and it's a great film, and really the direction that DC Films should be going to in the future. So what is to blame for Justice League's mediocrity? Well, I believe that it boils down to 3 things, and I lay these out in the petition, and they have nothing to do with Geoff Johns. So I want to talk about the 3 things that, from my perspective, based on what I've read, are the reasons why this film didn't do well. Now, on paper, without me speaking to it live, it sounds super harsh, but I want to make very clear, I know that this wasn't an easy thing to navigate for all the decision makers involved. There were hard decisions to be made all around. There was millions of dollars at stake. So I totally get that. And I'm not calling for Kevin Tsujihara's firing. Kevin Tsujihara is the CEO of Warner Brothers, and you'll see why that you could make a case for it. But what I am calling for is the right people to be held accountable. And sidelining Geoff Johns specifically for the failure of Justice League is not fair, because he had little to do with its failure. In fact, I think that Geoff Johns and John Berg did the best that they could to avert failure once the decisions were made that made this film tank. So let's talk about the three things that made Justice League mediocre. The first thing that made Justice League mediocre is the continued reliance of Zack Snyder. Now, I want to make very clear that I love Zack Snyder. I like his work a lot. I love 300. I loved his version of The Watchmen. I loved Man of Steel. Man of Steel is ragged on as a depressing, dark Superman movie. It's not. It's very hopeful. It's a great Superman movie. It gets the character to the core, and it's very, very underrated, and I think we'll look back on it very positively. I enjoyed Batman vs. Superman. That is a film that is fairly descriptive as not getting the character of Superman. However, being a fan of the characters, I enjoyed the sort of deconstruction of the characters and getting to their core, the Watchmen-esque making of the film. But I think that Superman star Henry Cavill put it best when he talked about why these films didn't resonate with audiences. And he said it's because they're niche films. I am a part of that niche. I'm a comic book fan. I'm very familiar with the classic version of Superman. And so it's kind of cool for me to watch a film and see an alternate version of the character. General audiences, however, might not necessarily enjoy that version of the character, and they clearly didn't, because Warner Brothers put Christopher Nolan and David Goyer in charge of this film, and Christopher Nolan and David Goyer are a team that saw The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises make over $1 billion each at the box office. And Man of Steel only made $668 million. So that's not nothing, but it's certainly not what Warner Brothers was expecting. So according to The Wrap, once this was put out, Greg Silverman, who's one of the executives at Warner Brothers, continued to rely on Zack Snyder. He basically gave him carte blanche on Batman vs. Superman, which was a huge mistake, because if Man of Steel didn't do well, clearly there needed to be some boundaries put in place for Batman vs. Superman. And if you don't like the boundaries, you don't have to make the film, but boundaries should have been there nonetheless. And they didn't do that. So we ended up with Batman vs. Superman, which was a niche film, and once again, the previous two Batman films before this made over $1 billion at the box office. Warner Brothers was expecting, that for this, especially considering it's the first time they've paired Batman and Superman on screen together. And the film made $872.8 million. It's a very, that's a huge number, and that's great. The film was profitable, but ultimately it was a disappointment with the studio that was expecting much, much more than that. So when production on Justice League came around, production on Justice League had begun before Batman vs. Superman. There was a decision, there was a crossroads to be made. Do we continue with Zack Snyder, or do we let him go and find somebody else to make a film that's more acceptable to general audiences? And rather than do that, the CEO, Kevin Tsujihara, made the decision, according to The Wrap, to keep Zack Snyder on the film, except this time they gave him very strict guidelines on what they could and couldn't do. They made Chris Terrio go back and rewrite the script with a lighter tone, and they basically made Zack Snyder make a film that he wasn't comfortable making. And the reports are that Zack Snyder's assembly cut, Zack Snyder wasn't happy with it. A lot of fans are clamoring for this Zack Snyder cut that would cost $70 million for Warner Brothers to make. Apparently Zack Snyder wasn't happy with it, and I think it's because he was being put in a position making a film that he wasn't comfortable making. So the fault for that, the fault for the continued reliance on Zack Snyder and forcing him to make a film that he wasn't happy with, ultimately falls on Greg Silverman and Kevin Tsujihara. So point number one, the continued reliance on Zack Snyder, the fault, the accountability should be on Greg Silverman, who's no longer with the studio, and CEO Kevin Tsujihara. The second thing that made this film mediocre was the mandate for a 2-hour runtime. You know, most successful superhero movies are 2 hours and 20 minutes. It's kind of a sweet spot. I agree that 3 hours is way too long for a superhero movie. My butt starts to get sore in the seats after a while. But 2 hours is really a short amount of time to introduce 3 new main characters, introduce a villain, set up a plot, and make it all work together cohesively. And frankly, they didn't give the replacement director, Joss Whedon, a lot of time to assemble a great film. And I think there were some choices made by Whedon that were a little bit weird, so yeah, he gets a little bit of blame, I think. I think the Russian family storyline was totally strange and weird, but an extra 20 minutes would have really enhanced this film. And fleshing out Steppenwolf a little bit more and giving the characters more chances to interact is never a bad idea when you're making a team-up film. And I think it would have made a world of difference in making this film better, especially considering all the rumors that are coming out about the plot and how it made it work better. So the 2-hour mandate, according to the Wall Street Journal, was mandated by Kevin Tsujihara, who is the CEO of Warner Brothers. So once again, point number one, relying on Zack Snyder, ultimately Kevin Tsujihara decided to do that. The mandate for a 2-hour runtime was Kevin Tsujihara. So far, Geoff Johns didn't decide any of this stuff. The third thing that made this film mediocre was once they realized they didn't have a film that was workable and that they needed to do more work on it to make it better, they needed to do extensive work on it, they should have pushed the release date back. A lot of the complaints center around the poor CGI, the poorly rendered out Steppenwolf, and I think the reason that we see that is because the CGI effects team was busy working on Henry Cavill's mustache. And had they pushed the release date back, they would have had a little bit of time to let Henry finish filming Mission Impossible 6 and to enable him to shave his mustache, so the visual effects team didn't have to spend so much time covering it up. And it looks really weird on film when you watch it. So they did these reshoots. I remember the reshoots finished and there was like 8 weeks until the movie came out. So it didn't give the visual effects team a lot of time to finish the film and really make something that they were really proud of. So who's responsible for that? Well, according to The Wrap and Humberto Gonzalez and Tim Malloy, CEO Kevin Tsujihara and President Tony Emmerich wanted to preserve their bonuses they would be paid before the merger with AT&T. And they were worried that if they pushed the movie, then their bonuses would be pushed into the following year and they might not still be at the studio. So so basically what's going on is AT&T is merging with Time Warner. There's no guarantee anybody's keeping their jobs because often, executives shuffle around and they put new people in spots and etc. And Tsujihara and Emmerich were worried that they wouldn't get paid their bonuses. So this is one point where I would actually slam them a little bit because this is just pure greed. And if you're not going to make a good product, if you're not going to put out a good film and you're a film studio, you don't deserve a bonus. You've made a decision now to put out a poor film. And in hindsight, looking back at it now with the great reception of Thor Ragnarok, this is really the first time a Marvel Studios film and a DC film were released around the same time. There's so much goodwill around Marvel Studios. Why in the world would you release a film so close to a Marvel Studios film? It's still going to make millions and millions of dollars. I think Scott Mendelson at Forbes pointed out that the opening weekend of Justice League that made $93 million, Thor Ragnarok made over $20 million. And Scott Mendelson correctly points out that that audience is an audience that might have gone and saw Justice League. And if you look at the Rotten Tomatoes score with Thor Ragnarok earning over 90% on Rotten Tomatoes and Justice League earning under 40%, what is that audience going to choose? The audience that would go watch a comic book movie. They're obviously going to go choose the one with a better Rotten Tomatoes score. By the way, I don't think that Thor Ragnarok deserves a 90% Rotten Tomatoes score. I think it's more like a 70, and I don't think Justice League it deserves a 40% Rotten Tomatoes score, whatever it is now. I think it deserves more like low 70s. I'd say Thor Ragnarok's a high 70s movie, and Justice League is a low 70s movie. But in any case, it's not a smart decision to make. This is about business decisions, and clearly these 3 business decisions were not smart on behalf of Warner Brothers. And so what I'm calling for in this petition is for Time Warner, the bosses at Time Warner, and AT&T to do an internal investigation of what happened with this and to hold the right people accountable. So if Geoff Johns deserves some of the blame for how Justice League did, well then he deserves some accountability. However, I will point out that the film that he's been most intimately involved with was also the highest grossing film at Warner Brothers this year, and that he knows the DC characters better than anybody else, and he knows the fans, what the fans are looking for, more than anybody else. So I want to really encourage, if this gets out to the bosses at Time Warner, to consider that when you're making decisions. I certainly think that Kevin Tsujihara deserves a lot of accountability, and of course Tony Emmerich, he was named in that rap piece for wanting to make sure that their bonuses were preserved before the AT&T merger. They both deserve some accountability. Geoff Johns should be running DC Films, and I think that if you do that, you're going to see a bright future ahead for DC Films. Tune in next week. I'm going to do a episode on what DC should do moving forward, and if you want to sign this petition, look in the comments. Thanks so much for watching.